Welcome to Healing the Patriarchy with Love podcast. I'm your host Luna, and together we're becoming rebels of the heart, one show at a time. You're listening to the Healing the Patriarchy with Love podcast. I'm your host Luna, and today we're very fortunate to be joined by Janice Salmon. Janice was a clinical nurse and now is a menstruation doula with the Red Tent movement. She's a Rose Reiki master and a woman on the Magdalene path, and she's also my friend. And I'm really, really happy and excited to have her here with us today. Janice, hello and welcome to the podcast, and thank you for giving your time to us.
Thanks for inviting me, Luna. It's nice to be here. It's nice for you to introduce me in that way as well. It feels different to be introduced as somebody on the Red Tent movement. I suppose not an awful lot of people know about the Red Tent. Is that right?
Yeah, I guess that is right. And maybe that's something that you could maybe just touch on a little bit if you feel to.
Yeah, I mean, the first story of the Red Tent is a biblical story, which only gets a very small mention, and is then in our modern day being brought into our way of thinking of the Red Tent as being a place where women go when they menstruate, where women gather and they come together to support each other. So for our modern world, I think it is a support centre, and however way that we honour the Red Tent is more about honouring ourselves at our time when we have our period. So we tend to do that in isolation these days, not in a gathering where we stay overnight in a lodge or something, which sounds very nice to get taken care of in that way. I think it's, for me, a reminder to enter into the Red Tent as a visual aspect, as a self-honouring, and to remind myself to just lay down the tools a little bit when I have been menstruating, and to just honour that cycle, that part of my cycle, as a bit of a retreat more than anything else.
Yeah, gosh, that feels lovely. And how wonderful that we used to gather. I wish we did that now. And it's an appropriate thing that you've just spoken about that, because we're actually here today to talk about periods. And I must admit, this is a little bit self-indulgent on my part because I love to talk about periods. So this episode is going to be a little bit different. Normally, I just kind of, as the host, I just ask questions and listen, but I'm going to join in a little bit. Janice will do majority of the talking and I will be asking questions, but I am going to join in a little bit just because I love periods. So whereabouts are you, Janice, when it comes to periods? Where are you on the menstruation path?
I'm in menopause, so I class myself as being menopausal, and I think it's a very difficult transition point. I'm very early on, I'm 6 months in, and I'm on a path where I feel I am learning an awful lot still, and trying to remember I'm still a cyclical being. I'm not linear just because my bleeds have come to an end. I'm still cycling. And to me, that means my body is still in a transition through a cyclical pathway. And I'm still having to honour that without the bleeds. So it does get quite complicated, because life in general means that the retreat inward phase, when I talk about the bleed, I mean the winter of my cycle, when I retreat like into the Red Tent. For me, that can be something that I forget to do because I don't have those pointers. They've gone, which is a big missing point, a marking point. on the path to retreat inwards. So I'm having to find my new sense of well-being and honor it, even though I'm not bleeding, still as a cycle. So I still cycle. It's just very much changed and it's very different. In my peri-menopausal years, and they were years, because that period of transitioning from a very regular routine to the menopause can take years. And I think that taught me the value of that retreat part being so needed, because I was very tired through my perimenopausal years, and I did find that quite difficult. So I'm still having to remind myself and get new signposts in place. And it is such a movement into something different. So where are you, Luna? Where are you? I'm going to keep asking you questions as well.
No, please do. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm perimenopausal and have been for a number of years, and it coincided really kind of like getting more deep into the perimenopause coincided with when I fled all the abuse in my life, which was 3 years ago. And because I had so much trauma, you know, alongside the perimenopause, it was a little bit much for me, which is why I've actually ended up on HRT after trying so many other methods and outlets. My hair was falling out. My skin was so dry. My eyes were dry. My mouth was dry. Everything just seems to dry up. You know, hair drying up, falling out, eyes dry, skin dry, mouth dry, periods drying up.
Yeah.
I felt like I became the desert. And I did, honestly, that's how I felt. And I was really struggling, as you mentioned there about the, you know, feeling tired. I literally couldn't lift my head off the pillow. I mean, I do have chronic illnesses that kind of add to that. So, you know, just so listeners know, in case you're not a perimenopause and thinking, oh my God, this sounds terrible. You know, there was a lot of complications to my perimenopause because I have a number of chronic illnesses. And as I stated, I had very severe trauma. But I think, and also I'm autistic, so people that are autistic struggle with change. So such a big transition was very difficult for me, which is why, you know, I did end up HRT after trying so many, you know, alternatives and things that I know work for a lot of people, but it just wasn't enough for me. So it's been interesting as well to hear you talk about, you know, menopause and what that's like, because I haven't really thought about, you know, what it's going to be like when I don't actually bleed anymore. Because I'm a bit weird. I actually like a bleed. I feel like I'm bleeding out anything that doesn't need to remain in the next cycle, you know, the next month kind of thing. So how, now you don't have a bleed, Janice, is it okay for me to ask you kind of, did you ever have that aspect that I have where it's kind of like almost like a detox and to bleed? And so if you did have that, how is it now without? Can you just talk a bit about that, maybe how it has been for you?
Yeah, I think looking through the menopause, because the perimenopause in itself felt like a tunnel for me. It was a bit of a pathway through the underworld to get a spiritual. I mean, all of this has a multifaceted context for me. Women as cyclical beings are full-rounded, holistic ways of being. So it's not just a physical thing to bleed once a month. It's a full cycle of however many days. The average is said to be 28 days. But every step along that path is a movement through 4 different phases. And when I got to the perimenopause, I found that shifted. And it was teaching me something about this deep life transition of going through this portal into the menopause and coming out completely different, and not knowing what that different bit was going to be is kind of mind-blowing in a way. It's like we don't know what's going to happen on the other side of this dark tunnel. And I don't mean it was a dark night of the soul kind of transition through them, but it's not that negative. But it was a portal, and at the same time a walk through things that I don't want to take with me, and a few life lessons coming back up to be seen. And it did feel like it was a big tunnel of learning, of deciding, what do I want to bring forward? What do I want to let go of? And what do I need to change? So the whole peri-menopausal had a big thing of things coming up that needed to be seen that I may have buried in the past, situations or challenges, and to try and think about, what do I want to take with me? So what are the positive aspects that I want of life in general I want to take with me into the menopause? So it did feel like a big discernment exercise in a way, of a big change, but filtering things out. So it's the same kind of analogy to the bleed time and the window of opportunity that we get when we bleed, to go, well, that didn't work. And, you know, like a big review. That didn't work this last month. I'm not going to do that again. I'm going to change it and try and do this that's different. Oh, I can see where I went wrong there. So this month I'm going to do it this way. And I feel that's what my bleed every month gave me, was a chance to really sit down and go, I'm just going to journal everything out and filter out what I need to let go of and what I need to carry forwards. So when I've come into the menopause, some of that charted territory is now gone, because I've not had a bleed that means I can sit and do that. I'm having to find a different way around that. So I do, in a way, miss that retreat period, that sitting down and having the rest, the great rest of the cycle, and knowing how then to move forward. So that kind of is the bit that I miss the most. The bit that I'm transitioning into is remembering that there are ways around this that have been around, and that women have honoured for, I don't know how long, hundreds of years, thousands of years even, and cycling with the moon again. So to take the moon as my markers, so to take the new moon as my period of winter, my bleed time, and say, women and generations behind me have done this for decades. So on a new moon, that's going to be my retreat, my solitude, my review. And having to remember that and to mark it in a diary, that my phases haven't changed. I'm a woman that cycles, but I have to look and make more of an effort to still get that deep soul rest that's needed in the everyday, because otherwise I feel like I kind of lose myself with the everyday, and I don't come back within myself and check in with myself as what do I need to know? What do I need to let go of? So it's come up as a real going back to, I suppose, what ancient women would have done. They cycled with the moon, and remembering that and having to remind myself that I still need that deep soul time for me as well. And not thinking about it being selfish, but it's part of who I am. It's part of what I've always done as an adult, and I still need to carry it forwards as well.
Yeah, I love that you're talking about markers there, because you're sort of talking about, you know, the actual bleed as the marker, which it still is for me at the moment. But then there's also, you can use the moon. That's really, that's helped me actually to know that, you know, when the bleed goes, I will still have something that I can use as a marker, because I'm like you, and I do actually kind of, I don't know what the word is, kind of, I just have an awareness really of where I'm at within the cycle, because it definitely does affect me. And actually this last bleed that I've just had a bleed, and I didn't get to rest like I normally would. It was very busy. So what would normally be kind of my, you know, my pre-menstrual phase, and then my menstrual, my bleed, I would normally sort of slow things down around them, but I just couldn't, because life just wasn't letting me. And I have to say, because I'm now sort of in spring, sort of coming into summer, so coming into ovulation, you know, I've been really grumpy, and I haven't been coping the same. And I do think it's because I wasn't, I mean, it was just how life was, but I just like wasn't able to kind of honor my body and where I was as a woman within that monthly cycle. And it's had a knock-on effect into this cycle because of that. Can you talk to us a bit more about, because I know I've just touched on the seasons there a little bit, but you know, maybe there's people listening that don't know about this, but I've always found it really, really handy to relate my cycle to the seasons. So as I was talking about then, you know, the bleed is winter, and then coming out of it is spring, ovulation is the summer, premenstrual is autumn, just because of the kind of the energy of the seasons and what happens in nature in the seasons. And I do think that happens within us as women as well, doesn't it? And it is reflected in the cycle. But can you maybe talk a little bit more about that? Is that something that you could share with us?
So I now recognize the moon as my point of reference, because I don't bleed like the winter. You said bleeding is your winter time, where we would hibernate as such if we're following the natural way of the seasons. So I'm now looking towards the moon, and I think what would have happened many years ago, this is kind of a bit of a myth and a legend, that women would bleed on a new moon and they would ovulate on the fullness of the full moon. And that's partly due to the fact that they wouldn't have had light pollution. So things like the fact that we have so much light around, we have lights in the house, we have mobile phones, computers, street lights, the skies polluted with light at nighttime, means that it's affected our hormone levels as well. So we no longer, as a community, bleed on the new moon and then ovulate on the full moon. And the nearest we get to syncing in with our emotions, the way that we feel, what our needs are, is to still go back to nature and follow the ways of nature with the seasons. So many books that we pick up these days that are on cyclicity, that are on periods, do speak more into the ways of seasons rather than the moon cycles. So the winter is classed as when we bleed, and it's a great honouring of the shedding of leaves of trees and going inward and hibernating, coming back to ourselves and having that time as well. In the winter, there seems to be an aspect of the inner season because we have time with ourselves. There's less to do outdoors. There's more to do inward. And then looking at spring as our way of coming back out into the fullness of the world. In spring, it's when things begin to germinate and we make plans and look towards the fullness that's about to bloom, which is the summer, when our estrogen levels are at their most highest. This is where we bloom. We come into full fertility as well. And then moving into autumn is where we start to look towards the harvesting of maybe what we've achieved, what we've not, what we've set out to do, what's not worked. It's like a big review point and a folding back inwards to be in gratitude and to look towards clearing some things away that make us have a better inward phase of winter again and coming back down to rest.
Thank you so much for that. That's a really good explanation. Thank you. What I was thinking then, it was just coming to me. I don't know if it hasn't quite landed, but we have this kind of like monthly cycle. It's roughly monthly, isn't it? Like you say, the average is about 28 days. But our kind of like journey from menarche, when we very first have a period, through to menopause, is that also like the seasons?
Yeah, it's often spoke about in terms of the maiden, the mother, and the crone, or the magger. And it is a little bit like that it still follows the nature of things. So the maiden aspect, the youngness of who we are and beginning our bleeds, and this pivotal point of when we step into our womanhood. And in a lot of respects, we kind of lost the way that we do that. It was always seen as a big honoring. If you go back in history, that a woman had reached her womanhood and was fertile and was coming into her fullness of her power. And we kind of don't recognize that as a pivotal point in life, as in it's not celebrated the same. And then as we move further through our bleeding years, that's considered like the mother aspect, the adult of where we are. And then moving further along from that, the magger, or the queen of who we are, and then into the elder as well. So it's either called the magger or the crone phase. For me, you've just reminded me of like the first ever bleed and what that feels like. How prepared are we for that first ever cycle? And it's just reminding me that I'm not quite sure if I was prepared in such, it wasn't explained to me fully. But then again, it was more concentrated on that winter cycle alone. It's like you're going to have a bleed, and this means that you're now a woman, and this is what happens. This is how you cope with it. And then it stops, and then you can carry on as normal. And part for me coming into this awareness from doing the work with menstruation over the last, I think it's probably the last 10, 15 years that I've been certainly reading about it and looking into it and trying to navigate myself, is that we don't just have one phase when we have menstruation. We're cycling through the whole of our days. So when we bleed is day one, and then that can take us roughly on a 28-day cycle. And for me to try and remember that I'm cycling all of the time, not just for 1 week of the time, actually brought around a lot more positive insights on what was happening in my body and in my emotions when I began to track what I was doing or what my emotions were doing. So it was less about the physical signs throughout the month of the 28-day cycle that were important. It was more about where I am emotionally and intellectually as well. So when I started doing the tracking, I realized there were patterns to this that I could then go back to or start fitting into, as in work would be far more productive if I took into account there were certain parts of that track of that cycle that I was, one, more productive, and two, far more analytical. And at other times I was just completely tired as well. So to make sure that in a diary I wouldn't jump too far ahead. So when I was ovulating, I was being all super powered in my enthusiasm, and I would say yes to everything, forgetting that there's a transition point that takes me into autumn and winter. And if I've not remembered to consider that the next 2 weeks are going to be far less energetic, I could really get myself into some sticky problems then. And, you know, if somebody wanted to take me on a trip out or organize going walking, if I did it like, oh yeah, that sounds really good, I'll put that in my diary for 2 weeks. But in 2 weeks' time, I'm in my winter. And it really did make me have to think and consider the timing of everything throughout the whole of the month. Every single day of the month was important, and it was different. And I think the transition points of that really brought home to me how much I feel tired and don't want to do things, and how much I cancel things because I've overestimated myself when I've been in my summer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, and it definitely ties up with how I am as well, because yeah, I'm the same. So it's almost like pacing yourself is similar to that. It's kind of knowing what your limits are going to be at what point.
Yeah.
Within the cycle, and using that to your advantage, isn't it? Because it's not negative, it's positive. If you can have the awareness of it, then as you were saying, you can look in your diary and think, oh, well, actually, you know, I'm going to be bleeding. That with more time to myself and a bit more reflective and period. And I think, you know, you spoke about retreating and hibernating and that kind of thing. But then when you're coming out of that, you know that you can put a little bit more in and kind of build to when you're ovulating, when you've got more energy.
Yeah.
But have that as a kind of like a guide. So it's not a given, it's a guide. So, like, for example, I was talking about how life didn't kind of allow that for my last end of cycle. But it was okay because it is just a guide, but I'm also aware that it has had a knock-on effect kind of thing. So interesting as well that you were talking about menarche, because yeah, do you know, I don't really remember the exact day when I first began my period. It's funny what stayed with me, because what stayed with me is bled before me. So I think I wasn't like really late, but I was kind of one of the sort of middle to late, I would say. So I was at least 12, possibly 13. And I remember it hurt. And I was a bit scared, even though I'd been told about it. You know, I wasn't certain really of what exactly was happening to me and how exactly to deal with it. And although my mum did actually, my mum used to be a nurse, so she did actually tell me kind of the physical aspect, and she did warn me that there would be pain, but she told me that I would just need to get on with it and not complain. And so I was also quite scared about, you know, I mustn't complain, I mustn't make a fuss, I mustn't ask anybody about this, I mustn't speak about it. And I don't know if that's changed that much these days. I think there's more information out there, and at all. Well, that was certainly my experience, was that it, best if you don't talk about this.
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
what was your experience like? Do you remember much about it?
Not an awful lot of information, mostly about the actual bleed. So my mum did explain to me that, it would last for this amount of days and you could feel uncomfortable and to rest. She did tell me to rest. Um, but there was, yeah, I think that's where there's now a shift in how we approach this for the generations ahead. Because now there are books. I mean, there were no books when I was first bleeding on menstruation. There might have been a biology book, but there weren't women writing about cycling with the season, with the moon, that there are these days. And this for me was the first approach that brought that positive spin into things, these superpowers that we can put into the tracking apps. Or I preferred always to do it with pen and pencil, just because I could make it my own. And the apps seemed to jump ahead quite a bit and not be completely accurate. And there wasn't, a lot of the apps seemed to be on about predicting your next bleed, whereas I was less interested in that. I wanted to know more about what was happening throughout the whole of my cycle. So I started doing my own tracking. And it can be as complicated or as simple as people want it to be. For me, the most simple approach was to just think of one word of how I was feeling or what my needs were and write it on a cycling chart, just a circle, and then divide it into slices and just write day 1, tired, day whichever, 11, happy, joyful, just and navigate with just one word and one feeling. And now we can see that a lot of these authors in the books are calling these things superpowers, and they do relate to the hormones in our bodies that peak at those times in the seasons. So for instance, if I'd known more when I was younger that if I wanted to revise for an exam or write an essay and make it super sharp and to the point, I could have been doing that in my autumn time when I'm highly analytical, because my period hormones are kicking in more progesterone, which makes us that way. And it makes us start to look at things in a very clear focus. So knowing that for writing things like assignments, reports, essays, reviewing documents would have been really useful. And then to know that when I need to get really discerning in planning is when I do that in my springtime, when I'm starting to feel the shift of the energies coming out of my winter. Sitting with lists and charts is a really good thing to do in my springtime. And just being really aware of what the superpowers are would have brought more positivity in, I think. I could have got into my winter thinking, I don't have to just rest. There are things I can do to be productive in a different way when I bleed. So thinking about, I'm very detailed in that time. And, truth telling is something that comes up a lot of the time in people's winters, where they can really tell what's true and what's not, and be quite focused on what they do want to do and what they don't want to do anymore. A really good reflective time is somebody's winter. And I think that would have been really helpful in my teenage years, certainly with schoolwork and homework, to know when to do the active stuff and when to do the real sitting down, and getting into your homework with your cycle would have been really useful. And to making certain times and tracking a lot easier with the things that I need to do in the everyday. Like when you said that you've had a really challenging winter and it makes you slower coming out into spring because you've not had that time to yourself. It kind of makes us look at the transition point on how we're feeling if we have had to change things around just because life does get in the way sometimes. And then to put things into place, to say, okay, you can mark that down, know how that felt, know how that responds to the body as well as the emotions as well. And then one thing that I did for a younger relative of mine was when we knew that she was coming up to her first period, her menarche, there was something that we did that was done by a charity quite a few years ago, which was to create a red box, which is something to gift to the person on their first bleed. So it's a box filled by family of things they might like in their winter phase. And it's a big gift so that when somebody does enter into their first bleed, there's more information about these superpowers because there's items being collected into their box. So it's like a big red gift box full of goodies so that when they do retreat into their winter, they've got these tools that they know are sacred to them. This is a time to do certain things. And then there's things in the box that come out into their spring. So I just thought that was like a wonderful way of helping somebody that's new to their cyclicity.
Sorry, you cut off there, Janice. I just heard you talking about getting a red box that relatives put, nice things.
Yeah, it was something that I'd done for a family member and invited all the females in my family to get a box, and for this person's first bleed, it would be gifted to them. So it would have, it'd have items that were very useful. So things like a journal and some nice socks and some red nail varnish for when they come out into their spring. And it was just a reminder of the superpowers as they moved and came into their cyclicity. They would have tools that they could add to themselves, but it was started as a gift. And I just thought that was something as a new way of creating ritual and ceremony back into these stages that we are.
Somebody that is just it's so simple and so easy, but it's so beautiful. It's quite powerful in its simplicity to do that. And it kind of allow. And how was it received?
I think they were a bit overwhelmed to begin with because there was things that had been collected for probably about 6 months, maybe a year. So I think they were quite overwhelmed at first about the fact that they get this gift. They didn't know they were going to receive it. And then as time's gone on, they've realized, oh, this is really good because it lives on top of the wardrobe and they get it off the wardrobe usually around their autumn time when they start to feel that things are slowing down a little bit. And then they've taken out some things that they want and then put it back, and then they get it out again when they are in their bleed. And they like the fact that it gives them time in solitude in their bedroom, because it's expected as well. And they've been adding to it, so they can put their own journal, they've put other things in there that they like. And it was encouraged that, you know, if there's certain chocolate that you want to eat, you could put it in the box maybe when you're thinking about it, rather than asking at the time that you want to eat it in your winter. You know, do it earlier. So instead of the wardrobe then being a place where it was stored, it's now becoming more and more that this red box is on and off the wardrobe. So it's nice to see that they're utilizing it and thinking ahead of, maybe they're not tracking at this moment in time, but they're certainly thinking about, oh, I'd like that in my box next time. So they're preparing a bit more. And it was just one of those things where I thought I would have loved that myself in my teenage years, to be able to do that. And then what I ended up doing was creating a red bag for myself. So, and I hung it just behind the door. So I had a red bag in my peri-menopausal years, because I needed different items in my bag that I would have done when I was younger. So I found for the peri-menopausal years, the bag was pretty useful for certain times of stress, and when I needed different kinds of tools. So things like, I got an aromatherapy blend made just for me by an intuitive aromatherapist that was just there for when I was having my winter transition from autumn into winter, which I was finding even more challenging. And we probably know that as premenstrual stress, PMS or PMT. And I found that transition really difficult as I was in my perimenopause. So to create myself a bag at that time felt like a real big gift and a big weight off my shoulders as well, because things were already prepared. And that PMS of getting everything sorted as it should be, as I want it to be, was one of my challenges. So to have this bag there, where I was thinking, in my summer when I'm active, I need to prepare a little bit more and just know that this is temporary, it's all shifting, but there are different things that I can do to make life a little bit easier. I had quite a lot of bloating, so having certain trousers, certain clothing pre-prepared and put in the bag made life easier. And it was just using these tools slightly differently, the trackers slightly differently. And I do see the value of that these ways of doing things with the tracking cycles does create shifts that then helped me go into perimenopause as well. So I think if I could have received myself something like that when I was in my earlier years, I would have been more prepared for my perimenopausal years as well.
Yeah, that's right, isn't it? Because it's kind of starting you off on the right foot early on, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's so much in this, like you were talking about, you know, how it would help in school. And that, of course, would then follow on to workplaces. It would even be incorporated into motherhood. You know, you might know, for example, that when you're bleeding, you're going to need a bit more support as a mother. Possibly even, you know, a babysitter. There's so much that's kind of not quite yet in place for people, but I think we are making progress, I think. And I think there are still some cultures that do celebrate menarche and kind of the coming of age
Mm.
in their own ways. And I would just like to see a bit more of that in the Western world. I remember one time I worked somewhere and somebody's daughter had just started their period, and they came, and the mother worked in the office and came in, and they were sort of saying, oh, she's in the shower all the time because she thinks she's dirty and she doesn't want, and she wants to keep it a secret. And
Yeah.
I just found that really actually upsetting to hear, that was how she was finding it, and that she thought she was dirty. And I thought, where has she got that idea from? But I think sometimes that taboo is still around, I think, isn't it? And I know here where I live, I donated some period products to the community in the pandemic, and they were quite almost embarrassed to receive them, and then they wouldn't let people ask for them, so people had to say like a code word in order to get them. I was just, you can imagine me, I was just like, is this actually happening? What? We're going to use code words. We're all going to act like, as if we were, I don't know, smuggling drugs or something. not handing out period products. It was just very almost like a Twilight Zone for me, that kind of really enjoys the fact that I have a period and that I'm a menstruating woman. And I guess I'm lucky that I feel like that, and not everybody does. But I mean, what do you think there is about that? Where's that coming from, this idea that it's dirty? I was quite shocked really by that.
I mean, it's historical, really. There are so many things that are written from many years ago that claim that women shouldn't be touched while they bleed. It goes back in history. And I think it still is around, but it gets challenged far more in more recent years. Things like, in a supermarket, the aisle used to be labeled sanitary products. And it was like, no. That needs changing. So I think in most supermarkets now, they've heard women ask for period products, but it doesn't need to be sanitized. They're just period products. And I think that has been quite a big recent shift. I mean, we've all put a sanitary towel, a period product, and labeled it many different names over the years. And we've written it down probably many times. And now it's nice to see that it is getting spoken about a bit more. And, if you go on Twitter, anything like that, there are groups that are there being far more neutral in the language that they speak. And it is moving, it is starting to shift and change. And, I remember putting a product, tucking it inside a pocket to make sure I'm not seen walking down a corridor to go to a bathroom with it. And so there's still a little bit of shame or hidden identity with it as well. But that is moving, and it is starting to change. And I think in the last 3 years, there's probably been more highlighted awareness around the workplace and around women's health in general. I think there was an American paper that came out about 2 years ago to say that menstruation is going to be recognized, or they were trying to implement it as being recognized as the 5th vital sign. So when we have a health assessment, we have our blood pressure, our temperature, the heart rate, your respiratory rate, but the 5th sign is to ask where we are on our cycle and how we feel about it as well. So that was nice that it was being brought into an overall women's health assessment. And I think part of that conversation is opening the doors a little bit more into the workplace as well. And certainly it's been shown over recent years that home working does work. It doesn't work for everybody, depending on what kind of line of work they do, but it doesn't devolve as a sick day. And there's lots of discussions being opened up around, is there such thing as period leave and that's separate to sick leave? Are the policies in place for women that are finding certain days challenging, and are they being spoken about in the workplace? And I think one of the aspects, one of the groups of people opening up the conversations wider is the menopause cafe. And that seems to be bringing this back into menopause into the workplace. And hopefully over the years, it will start to be that the menopause cafe and their discussions about workplace will open up policy and procedures being put in place for the generations ahead into menstruation in the workplace. But it certainly has taken a long time coming, and it's probably a lot slower than we'd like. There's no national standard or policy currently in force. It's more around conversations. But I think the more that we have conversations like this, the more it's highlighted and the more that it gets spoken about a bit more freely. And there's hope at the end that things will change by people opening up and having a say. Then all we can do is keep having the conversations and hoping that workplace changes in some shape and form. Because I certainly wouldn't want any of our younger generations to feel that they still need to be hidden and have that feeling of shame or not being heard and not being witnessed when they bring up issues themselves.
Yeah, I definitely hope that that improves, and I think it's great that there is, some movement in that regard. And I know there's been an awful lot, on the TV and things like that about menopause, which has kind of helped people to open up about it and to talk about it, and for workplaces to actually have an awareness of it. And I think any movement away from, not understanding or not allowing women what they need to support them through their cycles is a positive move. I know myself, I've worked previously in a very patriarchal place. And yeah, I was the same. It wasn't even that long ago either. And I was kind of, in my period pad up my sleeve to go to the bathroom. And even that, if somebody noticed what you were doing, would get, an actual, not even an inner, an outer, and one time I flooded, my period flooded, and I just had to get cleaned up as best I could and changed there, because it was not the sort of place that would support me going home to get showered and saying, well, actually, you're bleeding that heavy that you shouldn't really be in work. And I could have done some work from home, but it would have been hard. And I think, that was really difficult. I was very uncomfortable all day. I wanted a shower, as you can imagine. I was really desperate to get home, have a shower, get cleaned up, and just to be able to rest. I just really, kind of needed that. And I think it's a shame that some workplaces just don't have that kind of understanding, and my periods have always been reasonably normal. They've been, very heavy at times, but I don't have any illnesses. And I think about women that have got, illnesses, endometriosis, polycystic ovaries, or any other, illness that kind of affects menstruation and the cycle. And I just feel like if we can't even get support for people that are kind of having an average type period, how can we hope for these women to be supported that are really, having very difficult times with their period.
Mm.
That's what really concerns me, that if we're not even at a point where we can support the average woman with, that has a kind of reasonably normal cycle. I know because all cycles are different, it's quite difficult to consider them to be average, but to me, they don't have any big difficulties. How can we then support women that are actually really having, very difficult time? Because I do know some women do.
Yeah. I think it comes full circle, really, doesn't it? Back to what is the red tent movement right now, and how can groups of women support other women in gathering together. Certainly, I know I spoke a lot about the Menopause Cafe and it being this event that happens in the community for women to attend and talk about anything to do with their lives that are relevant through the menopause. And it's always nice to see red tent gatherings happening for those menstruating years as well. What'd be even nicer is if they joined together. So you would have women who were in their menopause joining the women that were in their menstrual years and creating a fullness of that community gathering again. And it doesn't have to be at the time of people's bleed. It could be any time for people to just come and be heard and to talk about what they find challenging. And again, to bring a positive aspect into it and talk about what their superpowers are and how they harness them. Because sometimes that language and that speaking aloud in that way can have a very big interaction with somebody else that's not heard that language before. And it starts more conversations. And I sometimes think that it's when women gather and have conversations, that's when women do make changes in their own community as well. And it's having that opportunity to do it. And part of the red tent movement is bringing women back together for this reason and starting these conversations in the workplace, in the community, in hospitals, as well as in their charities, and making it a bit more visible and a bit more acceptable to have these symptoms and issues highlighted in a bigger context. I mean, it goes as far wide and far around the community in all aspects. Things like how many public toilets are now available in somebody's community? How easy is it to go to the loo, to change a product? How many places are open to that? Because, there was a time over the last few years where public toilets have been closed and women having to find different public toilets to go to that may be privately owned. And it's just about making it a community for all and not for the healthiest, most diverse and encompassing part of everybody's needs. And I think conversation is just the starting point. And it brings us back into that. This is a community thing. It's not just about young girls, menstruation. It involves the whole of the community to make these things more seen and more visible.
Yeah, and actually it affects the whole community, doesn't it? Even if there are people that think it doesn't affect them, because if everybody's supported through if every woman is supported through her cycle, and that helps her to reach her full potential as a human being, and if a person is helped to reach their full potential as a human being, that lifts everybody up, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I love what the red tents do, and I think it's absolutely amazing. We are coming sort of to the last sort of 10 minutes together today. Is there anything that you haven't said that you want to say?
I think the one thing that I wanted to mention was the transitioning points when people find things a little bit difficult. And certainly we know premenstrual stress is one of the most biggest associated aspects of cycling. And just something that I'd picked up when I was in my peri-menopause that I was struggling with more often was that entering into that phase and coming out of it. And at some point, finding that the most difficult thing was knowing that my hormonal drop meant my mood dropped as well. And I found that if I walked it a bit like a pilgrimage, it made it feel like there was a beginning, a middle, and an end. So just that if there's any aspect or phase of the cycle that people find most challenging, it's to really think about using that as a way of walking, whether it's choosing to walk it as a labyrinth walk or a pilgrimage and take an ally, or bringing a helpful person, just somebody that can be phoned and said, I'm really struggling with these next few days, and having somebody just send them messages, or making it into a bit more of an inward journey, identifying something like a goddess, a spiritual being, something to pray to, somebody to pray to. There were such things as moon prayers that were listed in one of the books that I have on menstruation, which seemed like a really beautiful thing to do when things get challenging, is to think we're not on the journey alone. We can ask for help at any time. And that help doesn't have to be physical help. It can just be that somebody is there to support, to think about who can you phone just to cheer you up a little bit? Or is there a deity, a goddess, a figure, a role model that you can look towards and just get some image of that out to anchor into? That was something that I found most helpful, was to create this. If I'm going on this downward journey of premenstrual stress, I need to come back up and out of that as well. And to know that I could just carry something with me, even if it was a crystal or a symbol of something, was a reminder that this is a very short part of my cycle, and it's a difficult transition, but there's a positive to coming out of it as well. And just having something visual did help me an awful lot along the path to figuring out where the walk was taking me in the long term as well.
Yeah, that almost sounds like having a menstruation taliswoman.
Yeah.
New
Yeah.
word. Like you said, like there could be a goddess or even just a role model. It doesn't have to be spiritual. To kind of just remind you and almost like anchor you that it's going to be okay. Yeah, transitions can be tricky, but they're always okay, and they do lead us into a better place, don't they?
Yeah.
Eventually, although of course we have to be in the moment with them. So I think that what you've just suggested is a really simple ritual to just kind of carry something with you and have it. And because it's visual, like you were saying, and it's actually like a little physical crystal or whatever you choose, just being able to kind of touch it and hold on to it as well.
Yeah.
It's powerful, that, isn't it, to be able to do that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion. I love that. And moon prayers, well, they've definitely piqued my interest. Who would have thought with my name? Yeah, they've really piqued my interest, that would be wonderful. Well, Janice, you've been absolutely amazing today. I've loved it. I've had so much fun, and I wish we could just actually talk about periods. But I think we have come to the end for now. Do you want to just kind of let people know if they're interested in kind of maybe following you on social media, or if they want to get in touch, if they would like to pay for your services as a menstruation doula, or indeed for Reiki or anything else? Do you want to kind of say where they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, a lot of my details are on my website, which is medicinalmeadows.com.
Okay, yeah. So they can kind of find everything there, like Facebook, email, and all that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So for the listener, I do just want to apologise because whilst the recording has sounded crisp here, I've just been aware that it seems to have dropped out every now and again. I really hope that you've still been able to follow the episode, and I'm so sorry if you haven't. Both myself and Janice live quite rurally. You know, it's not kind of somewhere where you get great internet, and I think possibly there's been a bit of disturbance with the internet, but maybe at times we weren't even aware of it. So I'm so sorry if this turns out to be a bit of a jumpy or a jumbled recording. I'll certainly do my best with it when it comes to kind of editing it and see what I can do, but please accept my apologies for that. And if you want to follow me, I'm available on facebook.com/Luna Louise Anna. So thank you so much, Janice. Honestly, you are just amazing. Your knowledge and wisdom on this subject is incredible. I know you, but I didn't know that you knew so much and that you can articulate it so well. I really feel like you're almost like a menstrual advocate with your wisdom. So it's been wonderful. It's helped me. I've learned things, and I'm sure the listeners will be very appreciative of the time and what you've shared with us all today. So thank you so much. And to our listeners, thank you and goodbye. And I hope you come back and subscribe and follow for more. Okay, thank you. Bye, everyone. You've been listening to the Healing the Patriarchy with Love podcast with Luna Anna. Subscribe and follow to join the tribe of Rebel Hearts.